Oh, he's resigned. Sorry.
Welcome to Election Day with Byline Times. Yes, we're coming to you from the Byline Festival. I'm Peter Jukes, co-founder of Byline Times, and I'm joined by the paper's amazing editor, Hardeep Matharu, by its political editor, Adam Bienkov, by its chief reporter, Josiah Mortimer, and one of our most esteemed, most amusing, most insightful columnists, Otto English. Thank you also to the live audience here in Dartington. The camera there's no camera to show you back at home, but we have a lovely audience as we begin our festival, which goes on for the next 3 days. But obviously, we're here to talk about last night. I don't know how many of you at home stayed up to watch your favorite Portillo moment. Maybe it will never be a Portillo moment again. Maybe it'll be called something else, like a Rees-Mogg or a Truss moment. We don't know. But enough from me. We're quite tired, but we have many things to say. Many things to say, particularly differently to how the media portrayed last night. Because as the next polls came in, as we reported, there's talk of a reform surge as Nigel Farage returning as president. There was all kind of ridiculous focus on a party which, well, let's go over to Adam first. How many seats did Reform get, Adam?
Well, as you say, when the exit poll broke last night, it suggested they were going to get 13 seats. And sort of much of the coverage of the BBC over the coming hours was relentlessly focused on Farage. And I think Clive Murray described it as the story of the night. Even when their own forecast reduced those 13 seats to 4, they still carried on talking about Farage. In the end, he ended up just with 4 seats, the same amount of seats as the Green Party got on much less coverage. And of course, there were 5 independents.
5 independents.
Pro-Gaza independents, which is more than the research. And so I think those stories were definitely sort of downplayed in the coverage and downplayed in the coverage last night as well.
There's also talk, we'll go to the individual results. I'm happy, we can't really get the camera in the audience, but you can shout out and a mic will come over to take questions from you. But there was talk about Labour dipping its share of the vote. But isn't that what we expected, given if people voted tactically, they would go to the Lib Dem candidate or indeed a Green candidate, or sometimes obviously slightly because they're more against Labour independent candidates. Did you have is that now the new media narrative? Oh, poor turnout, Labour hasn't surged.
Well, I mean, it is the case that Labour's final vote percentage is similar to what they got in 2019, although they did grow a lot in Scotland. They went back a little bit in Wales, but stayed roughly where they were in England. So the reason that the Conservative Party have suffered such a huge defeat is because of their collapse of the vote. I think a lot of that is to do with tactical voting. And potentially it could be to do down to the kind of supermajority narrative. Lots of people deciding that there wasn't much point in turning out and actually backing the Labour Party. I think there is the potential for Labour to actually increase their share of the vote in coming elections in the same way that the Conservative Party increased their share of the vote after 2010.
So what would be your story of the night politically? Obviously, nobody's really talking about the collapse of, well, almost, of the SNP. They lost how many seats in the end? 40?
Well, the collapse of the SNP was, it was much greater than in percentage terms than what Conservatives have.
And the rise of the Greens from 1 MP to 4?
Yep, big success for the Greens.
Big as Reform, if they both go in a taxi. Obviously, the Green taxi would be an electric one, and
the Greens won those 4 seats on a lower share of the vote than Reform. So they're actually much more efficient in their vote than Farage's party.
And before we go to the highlights, who stayed up of sort of those Portillo Truss moments, what is the other story? Would you say the Lib Dem story? That again, they now have, I can't even work it out, 15 times as many MPs as Reform. Did they get 15 times as much coverage?
No, and I think the coverage of the Lib Dems kind of focused on Ed Davey and his kind of water-based antics. But really, that was one of the massive stories of the night. They increased their share of seats by 5 times, roughly, winning in parts of the country which have been Conservative for as long as anyone can remember, winning most of the seats, I think, in Oxfordshire, places like Henley. Whitney, so David Cameron and Boris Johnson's former seats. 4 of the last 5 Conservative Prime Ministers, the seats that they had have gone.
Has Theresa May's seat gone?
Theresa May's seat has gone.
Oh, my God.
And may I just say on the Liberal Democrats, I think that Ed Davey ran what was the most human campaign of the general election. I really do. I know there's a lot of focus on these stunts and the ways to get the Liberal Democrats publicity, but actually, when you looked at some of their party political broadcasts and the way they talked about issues such as care, which wasn't really mentioned prominently by either of the other major parties, I thought there was a real human element to it, and it's just so striking. So right now, Sunak is meeting the king and has resigned as Prime Minister, and he, according to the BBC, has said, "I heard your anger and disappointment." But literally until 2 days ago, he was saying what the British people want and need is stability with the Conservatives. It's just so striking. It's so hollow. And I think in that sense, the Liberal Democrats deserve a lot of credit. They ran a really quite authentic human campaign, and I think the Greens did the same thing. And I hope we see some more of that come into the political culture.
And the Lib Dems, they focused on issues that their voters and former Conservative voters care about. You look at their leaflets, a lot about local hospital services, which Conservatives completely ignored over the course of the campaign, and a lot about sewage as well, which is actually a big, where the Lib Dems did really well in these elections. It's actually an area which have been really hit by sewage in the southwest and in some of their sort of...
One of those areas, which is an interesting seat, I was asleep at this moment, so you have to get details for me. Liz Truss's seat, what happened there? Because the Lib Dems were second, but actually Labour were planning to get Labour got that seat, didn't they? And that was the seat where there's issues of water pollution.
Well, the vote was split quite heavily in Liz Truss's seat. There was an independent standing there as well. And so Labour kind of came through the middle. All of the parties on fairly sort of low, relatively low percentage of the vote.
Fantastic.
I think that really is another story of last night, which is that you did end up with some very weird results. We're such a multi-party democracy now, but we have this completely two-party voting system. So people ended up being, absolutely stunned and completely taken aback by some of the results. I think in some seats, the independents rising.
I was going to ask you about that. Yes, the independents, the Green, because you followed them. So one of the shocks of the night was quite a close advisor to Keir Starmer, very prevalent in the newsrooms, was John Ashworth, wasn't it? So, and he lost to an independent candidate. So maybe, because you talked to some of these people, did that take you by surprise, the success of the Greens, the success of independents? Yeah,
I mean, I think the Greens, they ran an incredibly targeted campaign. They haven't traditionally been known for that. They've had a very inefficient vote. So a fair few people across the country fairly evenly supporting the Greens. But, that then, under first past the post, that means they get absolutely square root of bugger all. But this campaign, they said, we're going to go for these 4 seats, and they did it, and they won. And I think actually one of the things that came up when I was talking to voters, I went to Bristol and places like that, they felt during the election campaign, issues like climate were basically not talked about at all. And some of those voters did look to parties like the Greens to do that. Actually talking about the policy issues rather than just the shape of the polls, which I think has been a bit of a letdown of the campaign, actually.
And the rise of independence, is that something... Faiza Shaheen, a lot, and many constituencies with a big normal Muslim support for Labour. One independent is out, not to my sadness or loss for various reasons, George Galloway, but obviously Jeremy Corbyn came back in. And do you think there is signs of a sort of left-wing, a further left to Labour than Labour coalition, or with these particular circumstances about a historic horrific thing that's going on now, which could go away in 4 years?
I think there are particular circumstances, but I do also think it's part of a wider pattern of tribal politics really shifting. So I think what happened in this election was a lot of people who had voted for the Conservatives switched to Labour, some switched to Reform. I think that notion that people will always vote Labour, always voted Labour or Conservative, those tribal loyalties are really shifting. But for me, I think one of the striking things about seeing the coverage I saw was in the seats that were lost by prominent Conservatives, including Liz Truss, Jacob Rees-Mogg, there wasn't much contrition from what I could see. I mean, Liz Truss refused to answer questions by any journalists and just sort of walked out and said, I need time to consider what I'm going to do next.
It's the deep state.
There was not any notion that, God, you are not entitled to these seats in Parliament. But what was really interesting, and this is, I think, is the thing to watch, is Suella Braverman, who did hold her constituency, she gave a speech and said, I want to talk a little bit about the wider result in the country for the Conservatives. She apologised to the public. She said, we haven't heard you. I mean, she probably thinks that they weren't conservative enough. But regardless, she said, we have let you down. We haven't delivered what we promised. This is very much her positioning herself as a leadership candidate for the Conservatives. Really, really striking that there was some notion, and she said, we've taken your vote for granted. We're not entitled just to be in power. And there is something going on there. But the extent to which so many prominent Conservatives, who we always felt were in it for themselves, proved that by sort of being a bit stroppy last night, I thought was quite sad and striking.
And Suella Braverman is one of those who has suggested that Nigel Farage should be folded into Conservative Party.
But then very recently, very interesting, in the last few days, just before the election, she told the Telegraph that reform, any element of reform, should not be absorbed into the Conservative Party because of these racist comments that some of the activists were making. And she felt that Rishi Sunak had not sufficiently stood up for issues of racism as Conservative Party leader. So there's an interesting sort of shift going on. I do think she's positioning herself as Rishi Sunak's successor and will lead the party. I mean, we've always said, Peter, you know, is it the MAGA Republicans that they look to, or is it the Viktor Orban's Hungary that they look to? What are the forces in terms of the politics of the right that Suella Braverman would represent? But, I mean, she comparatively seemed quite, more humble.
Interestingly, she's positioning herself on the left on the issue of the two-child benefit cap, which I think is particularly striking.
So completely opportunistic.
Yeah.
And opposing racism when, she was condemning pro-Gaza marches as hate marches, led by Islamists. I think there's going to be a lot of very strange repositioning going on among
Very quickly as well, right, Josiah?
Yeah.
So I think we should, let's start on the second half of the show. We'll finish at, what time is it now? Probably about 12. We look forward to the Labour future. At the moment, we're doing diagnosis, aren't we? With the mortuary slab, Otto, of the Conservative England, is that the body is lying on the mortuary slab, and we are, dissecting its remains to see the cause of its death.
He paints quite a picture, doesn't he?
I have to stay awake at this time in the morning.
It's on the mortuary slab.
Yeah. And it's the body that we're doing a post-mortem.
Not too much. I had 2 breakfasts.
They call him 2 breakfasts Otto.
Yeah.
Otto, I wanted to ask you a sort of deeper, in a way, historical question. Because for all the blather and noise about 4 seats for reform, what we saw yesterday, particularly as Adam points out, seats in Witney, Maidenhead, Henley, Boris Johnson's old seat, Theresa May, David Cameron, 3 prime ministers.
And Truss.
And Truss, but those are 3 former seats of prime ministers. The long or sudden death of small conservative England. Now, your mother, I don't think I'm giving anything away, worked quite for senior conservative politicians in the 70s. So you understand this culture, though you're not of it. You rejected it.
So,
what happened to that conservative culture? Did they revolt against populism?
yeah, I keep saying this. This is not the Conservative Party. And the Conservative Party was always about management, or this is how they sold themselves, managing the economy, taking, care of the nation, driving things forward, and having some sort of narrative. People like Thatcher had a narrative. They were like people steering a ship towards a destiny or in a certain direction. This government that's just gone had no narrative, no idea, was running around in circles, conjuring up ever more lunatic ideas, like sending our children off to join the armed forces and whatever. No, then it became, no, they don't have to join the army. We'll just take away their driving licenses if they don't go and talk to a granny twice a week or something. I mean, these are not proper policies. And this has been the problem, really, since Brexit. There has not been a narrative. There has not been a direction. They have not told any story. They have just been sort of comedy, chaotic figures at the wheel as we've gone drunkenly down a mountain pass in a bus. And that is what has happened. The Conservative Party that my mother and father belonged to for all its flaws, didn't behave in that chaotic, disorderly manner, whether you agreed with them or not. And a lot of those people had a sense of public service and of public duty. My mother worked for Arian Eve, who was assassinated in '79, who more than slightly problematic figure, but he sort of had a sense of I'm doing something good for this country. I don't look at people like Gullis and think that he's lying awake at night thinking I'm serving the people. All people like Gullis, it's so Gullis. Gullis. All people like Gullis were doing.
Gutted.
Gullis
That
is
would be
part
the
of the sort
headline.
of
Gutted
Gutted Gullis.
sort of comical evil sidekick in a Disney movie or something like that.
With a
he's not
JCB behind him.
these are not, they were not serious people. And also, following Brexit, you had a sort of diminishing return on the leaders. They became, nobody like Sunak would ever have got anywhere near the top just 10 years ago. But as the party reduced into being a Brexit cult, they were left with this sort of shrinking pool of talent and ideas, and they were a party without ideas. And I really hope that Labour now sets out this is where we're going. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll talk about Labour in the next one. I just wanted to dig deeper on that.
Could I just add one last? So we've had a list of honours that have come out. I guess is it resignation honours?
What do they call these?
Dissolution honours.
People who have shown lots of dissolution.
And one of the people who now has a lifetime seat in the House of Lords is Chris Grayling. Don't know if people remember him, also known as Failing Grayling.
Lord Failing Grayling
He was
now.
Conservative MP for Epsom and Newell for a number of years. He didn't stand last night in the constituency. Gina Miller didn't win the constituency.
That's a shame.
It went Liberal Democrat for the first time in a very long time. I used to cover the constituency as a local reporter. But Chris Grayling was known for one thing after another, whether it was justice, transport, all sorts of sort of scandals. They should have been scandals, right? Failings. He now has a seat in the House of Lords. And this notion of service that Keir Starmer has, I think, to his credit, been talking about on the election campaign trail. I think this is really a key point, service. What is that about? And why are these people still ending up in, I mean, there's people younger than me in the House of Lords.
There's a Guido Fawkes.
Boris Johnson's just stuff. It's really, I think Otto is so right.
Yeah.
The entire notion of service under the Conservatives has completely been eroded.
Also, on the plus side, all of this chaos has revealed that the machinery of our democracy, a lot of it is incredibly out of date, including the party political system. These are 19th century and older notions. And we're not living in the 19th, well, Jacob Rees-Mogg, but everybody else is living in the 21st century. And we need a parliament and institutions which are fit for our age and not fit for 1824.
Yeah, let's start the second half, if we can, talk about Labour and its, if you like, its great comeback. Just digging a bit deeper on this issue of the blue wall. I mean, lots talked about the red wall. A lot of it came back. And I just want to note that in Byline Times, before the COVID contracts and all the scandals there, we had a measure, a financial measure of failing in the government and how much they lost on spaffed against the wall, as somebody famously said, on some government project. And the metric was a Grayling. Was it a 1, a 2, 3 Grayling error? So, but maybe I'll first go to Otto and then come back to everybody and think about this. Because we focus on the politicians. We focus, particularly since Brexit, on this sort of populism over very, in a way, very important, very narrow issue. Do you feel, when you look around, particularly this lovely room, and see what's happened with the vote, that the British people portrayed by these politicians who want to stop the boats, stop the votes, stop the bets, or start the bets, that actually there's been a massive awakening, revulsion of that kind of politics. And actually the British people, as we look around, as Jay Rosen said, who've accepted this result, they wouldn't in America, they say it's a steal, that you feel more enthused about the values of this country? Big question. The answer is you don't know.
Well, yes, I think it's a moment. There was a weird mood last night in this room, And there was a general lack of enthusiasm and positivity, which I do get, because it's like we've been engaged in some grueling marathon where we've all been, sort of Sisyphean marathon where we've been obliged to roll this great bollock of Brexit around for 7 years. And I think we, as a nation, are tired. And this feels like we just crossed the line. And I think that's why the mood was down last night. Yeah. I don't know what the mood in the greater country was, but particularly those of us who have sort of been engaged in this slugging match online for all these years, it was a sense of where we've done it. I do think it's a moment to be enthusiastic and positive and ambitious, and it's a moment for Labour to prove themselves, prove their mettle as this sort of guiding force and to lead us forward and to create a narrative. And as you say, and it's really, really important this, Farage does not represent anything, not even a teeny tiny proportion of the sentiments in this country. You know, he's what, on 14% or 13% or something. And I know somebody said to me on Twitter this morning, the far right got 1 in 6 of the vote. Yes, 5 in 6 of the vote didn't go to the far right, and the majority of people in this country, and I know this is unpopular with some people, but voted for centrists and centre-left parties, and that is where most of the people in this country are. And we have to turn that narrative around and stop sort of sucking up to the likes of Farage and co. In fact, I'm going to fine anyone who keeps mentioning Farage more than twice. It's a pint.
You've just mentioned twice any other mention. You've got to fine yourself. Adam, can I bring you back to the big...
Can I just add to that? I mean, I think we do have to be careful about how this is said. I think Otto's absolutely right about this. Already in the kind of commentary about this result, we're being told that this isn't really about ideology. This isn't really about the Conservatives being too right-wing. It's about competence. But actually, the competence is inextricably linked to the hard right policies that they pursued. It was the hard right ideological policy of austerity that means that hospitals aren't working now, that means that school roofs are collapsing, that means that the rivers and the beaches are failing, the privatisation, and et cetera, et cetera. These things are inextricably linked. I think Labour shouldn't try and sort of appease the right in the way, because there's going to be a lot of seats around the country now where Reform are in second place to Labour, and there will be some pressure internally on Keir Starmer to actually try and go further on immigration and try and mimic some of the attempts that the Conservative Party made to appease the hard right. But actually, Otto's completely right. It's only around 14% of the vote backed the Conservative Party, backed the Reform Party, and the Conservative Party only got around, I think, 24% of the vote. That's a complete trouncing of the hard right. And we saw in 1983, when Michael Foot's Labour, he won 28% of the vote in 1983 and around 200 seats. And that was described as the longest suicide note in history. And they were forced to go back to the centre ground. The Conservative Party have got much less than that in terms of the share of the vote, but particularly in terms of the share of the number of seats. So we need to see this what it is. This is a rejection of hard right politics that was put forward not just by Rishi Sunak in this election. Of course, that was the case. The conscription, deporting migrants to Rwanda, etc., but of everything that we've seen over the last 14 years and the general direction that the Conservative Party has taken.
Yes, it's very interesting because online, and some people arguing with me when I was tired late last night, this is the triumph of populism. It's on its way back. And this is like Le Pen. This is nothing like Le Pen's party. I forget what's renamed, Rimash or whatever it is. Fought against a brand new party, Macron's, and Macron's lost, but the old parties came back. Has 1/3 of the seats in the French Assembly. That would be Reform, the equivalent of 200 seats instead of 4. The other thing is, people say this is unprecedented. Exactly like 1983, wasn't it? There was an alliance between the SDP, but the SDP of its own had 7 or 8 seats. So we have been in this territories before. So why do you think, Adam, this narrative that or even the BBC, even Channel 4 to a certain extent, which for some bizarre reason had Anne Widdecombe on, no Green spokesman, as far as I could see. Why do you think this narrative happens, and how will they keep it going if we're facing a majority of?
Well, I mean, the BBC is somewhat separate. But we know why we've got this narrative from the press, because they cheerled all of these policies. They cheerled Liz Truss. At last, the Tory budget, the Daily Mail said about her 2022 budget. They've pushed for exactly the agenda that the Conservative Party has pursued over the past 14 years, and they can't be willing to admit its complete failure and rejection by the public. Why the BBC isn't willing to face up to that, and certainly wasn't in their coverage last night, I think is a separate question.
I also think, Adam, that there is part of the narrative is that the Farage and Reform and the more hard right parties, that what they tell the public is we represent the real people of this country, and why that narrative isn't questioned and scrutinized. It's not. It is internalized, I think, by journalists at the BBC who then think, oh, well, if we need to represent the real people and the views that everyone's scared to say out loud, then we have to have Farage on Question Time and we have to give them prominent coverage. But this, again, all the work we do at Byline Times is about looking at what impact that has, how the media is shaping how we think about this. But it is not questioning that narrative. And why is it, as Otto says, why does Farage represent the real people? Who are these real people?
Exactly.
What makes them more real than anyone here or anyone? You know, that's not
I
questioning.
mean, the other thing which I bore on about, and I will bore on about it briefly again, is entertainment and politics have combined into politainment. You see this in America with Trump, and you see it, you know, this sort of crazy, I think Adam was saying this last night, it drives engagement and viewing figures. Putting Nigel Farage, the reason he pops up on Question Time things, they know that will boost their viewing figures. Even people who hate Farage, well, that's a pint, will tune in to watch it. And so these populist, Popinjay-ish figures are part of that entertainment landscape of politics. And I hate to say it, but as I'm sitting here thinking, I think really Labour or the left or the centre, we need an anti-Farage, basically. We need somebody of that kind of populist ilk that will take him on. There's that famous bit of footage where Tony Blair basically nails Farage into the ground and says, you're sitting there with your flag, you don't represent this country stuff. I want to see someone do that. And what I found really depressing in those leadership debates was that Farage stood there like he's a normal politician. And as everyone was saying last night, he's not a normal politician. He is a far-right figure and should be treated as such.
We're going to move on in a moment to think about the future, but just a little bit more on that, because we'll also like to think about the media, and we'll take some questions. Farage went to Dulwich School, which is a private school, with a friend of mine, actually, and said some rather nasty things to him, racist things to him. He was a city trader. The Reform Party is a private company which is backed by billionaires. Why is it a sign of the media's own privilege, them all going to private school, that they somehow think that working class people are like Nigel Farage, that he sometimes represents them? In a way, is he the distorted mirror of our very elitist media system?
I'll just put a quick example in here, which is perhaps somewhat controversial, but we've talked about it before. The royal family and Jimmy Savile, for example. I mean...
Unpack that thought, Hardeep.
Well,
it's a very good one.
I mean, I was quite young, and I just used to occasionally see on television Princess Diana or Prince Charles, as he then was, meeting Savile at some sort of charity event. But there were also these black spider letters between the now king and Savile. This notion that Savile was a channel by which they could connect to the public, the ordinary public, the working classes, the vulnerable, the down on their heel. And that is really striking. No one really talks about that. Why? Why is Savile representative of anything? I mean, now we know what we know, but even at the time, I don't know.
No, I know people at the BBC who would say exactly the same about Farage and UKIP and would say they're the working people.
That was the same with Rees-Mogg people. I mean, those people who went to those very, very elite... I mean, there's a hierarchy in private schools.
Which you weren't in, you didn't go to one.
I was at a private school.
But not an elite one.
No, I wasn't in the top elite. There was somebody once described... In fact, I think Peter York once described it as the first 11 and the second 11 or something like that in terms of public schools. But the very elite schools, the Etonians, those people, if you've ever had entry into their world and hung out with those people, they are dwelling in a completely different universe to the rest of this country. They just do not get it.
And they're helped by the press in that as well.
Yeah, they are. Well, and then they all become,
everything out of touch, they say, is then reflected on front pages the next day.
So we had, that's classically, remember, before we look to the future, I want to look a bit more positively ahead. The last 15 years really dominated by two Etonians fighting over who got head boil. What's it? Top pop or something.
Yeah.
David Cameron, Boris Johnson. A lot of the turmoil is a fight between, because Boris Johnson didn't make head boil or something.
Boris Johnson never made head boil, or whatever they called it at Eton, and apparently it irked him. Yeah, for the rest of it, and has irked him for the rest of his life. And I think I've often said this. If you look at conservative politics over the last few years from the perspective of being a former public school boy, which I repeat, I am, it's very recognisable. It's very recognisable, jostling for position, coming up with this crazy national service idea. That national service idea is just what happens in most boarding schools writ large. In most boarding schools in this country, you still have a cadet force, and the people who opt out have to go and do what they used to call granny bashing at my school.
Granny bashing?
Granny bashing.
You go and bash granny?
No, you go and sit with a cup of tea and watch an Australian soap opera. That's based, you had to do community service if you didn't do it. It's exactly what Sunak came up with. And I'm sure they have exactly that at Winchester.
So moving over to Labour, just to reflect that a radical change happened with Rishi Sunak. We really went to the people, somebody had been educated at Winchester, which is the next school down with Harrow and Eton. So let's look forward to Labour. And just to open this up, since I think we are, with the exception of Otto, all state educated. One amazing fact, Josiah, I read this morning, is that 90% of the new Labour intake went to comprehensive schools.
Yeah. I think it's a big change. It's a big change. Yeah, let's do it. Yeah. Because I don't think classes come up very much during this election campaign, but I think it will make a big difference to how the country is governed. It won't change everything. You know, policies are what matters, but it will change where they come at policy from, those perspectives. So I think that's a big shift. And, you know, just the fact that the newspapers over the campaign were so obsessed with Labour's plans to put VAT on private schools. Yeah. Now, that concerns literally about 7% of the population. But it was a complete obsession. It was one tiny policy among, you know, hundreds of Labour policies, and the media were obsessed. And why is that? Because about half of columnists and senior journalists went to private school. They are almost as out of touch, perhaps more out of touch than the political class. And there's such a disconnect, I think. And that really has to be it has to be fixed. It has to be dealt with. And I hope that there's a realignment there.
As a bare minimum, we should expect our political leaders to educate their children in the schools where the rest of us send our children, and to use the health service that we use. And I think and I suspect that will happen under Labour.
I'm sure it will.
But we should expect it. And there was a point under Cameron where Cameron made a big show of sending his children to a state school and using the NHS. And somehow that got lost and it all became normalised again. I mean, if you're opting out of the things you're running to get something better, what does that tell you about your leadership?
I do think that's a big part of the kind of failure of Rishi Sunak's premiership is he didn't use the services, and he didn't even use the trains and roads. I mean, that's the... You know, who's literally flying.
Didn't use the ground, yeah.
And I think that was a big part of. I mean, one of the main reasons why the Conservative Party suffered under him is because he was seen as out of touch, literally out of touch with the ground beneath him. You know, it's. So I think that's something that is going to be a change.
And you're going to be in Parliament in the lobby. Obviously, you at the time when everybody's trying to get the Conservative briefings and listening to the door of the 1922 committee, very different. Do you see? And thank you, Adam's taken us to question time. You see a completely different culture from the Labour benches don't you, to the Conservative benches, men in suits, and quite a much more diverse Labour Party on the left-hand side. That's now going to switch over. And in fact, Labour are going to have to flow all the way over to the other side, aren't they? They're not going to be able to quite sit down.
I'm not sure how that's going to work. I mean, obviously, not everyone sits in the chamber at the same time, but yeah, it's going to be.
But the culture of Westminster is so like a public school. I can imagine if you went to Eton, prep school, Eton, Oxbridge, then to Chambers as law, and then to the Garrick Club and Parliament, you just never, it'd be the same all the way
I would
through.
say it's like Hogwarts gone wrong. And you know, a lot of the, you know, it's fair to say, actually some of the lobby journalists are from exactly the same world as the Conservative Party, went to some of the same elite schools. And there is that culture. And it would be interesting to see how that does change under a Labour government, and whether the media coverage will fit around that, or whether we'll see more of what Josiah says we saw during the campaign on the issue of private schools.
But let's get to the...
I just have a quick question for you, actually, because I think it's relevant. We're talking about the Conservative Party. We're about to come on to Labour.
We are coming on to
And
Labour
we're talking about elite, educated people. I want you to say a bit about one figure that we have all forgotten, apparently, Dominic Cummings.
Oh, Dominic
him
Cummings.
of Barnard Castle fame, because his professed aim was to destroy the Conservative Party, and it has happened. I think it's interesting just to unpick that a little bit.
Yeah, it's a very interesting character, isn't he? Because he is actually married to a member of the aristocracy. But he's not humble, sort of business person background, but he vowed to destroy the Conservative Party early on in their noughties. And then one of the funniest stories was he came into government in the coalition with Gove, but he was got rid of by whom? Andy Coulson, who was the News of the World editor, who suddenly convicted for phone hacking, who thought he was trouble, and obviously came back in when Coulson... His project, let's just have a quick word and mourn the eyesight of Dominic Cummings. His prediction was that Starmer didn't stand a chance.
That's right, yeah. I think he was saying that he should be replaced by a Northern woman, I think is what he suggested.
When did he do that?
About 3 months ago, he thought Labour didn't stand a chance. The prognostications of Dominic, the erroneous prognostications of Dominic Cummings.
He was also suggesting that he's going to start his own political...
Yes,
What happened to that?
Yeah, well, we'll see. Maybe it's about to be launched.
But coming back to the Conservatives, he always wanted to be a disruptor.
Yeah.
And in that sense, I mean, because he was a key figure in the Leave campaign, obviously.
And a lot of
Barnard Castle did that. I think it's funny, you know, Dominic Cummings saying he wanted to destroy the Conservative Party, because if you look at where the Tory poll ratings started collapsing, a lot of that was around the time of the Barnard Castle eye test, when he drove and broke those coronavirus regulations. That was when I think trust between the public and the Conservative Party really started to absolutely nosedive. It was this sense that there was one rule for them and another for us, and the narrative was only strengthened with every single Tory scandal, basically every week after that point.
What Cummings was also famous for was his Vote Leave campaign, and we've written a lot about this, have a book by Ian Lucas. Peter York, who's at the back, knows a lot about this, the culture wars, online amplification. I think one of the stories we will be investigating with the reform vote, sorry to mention the F word, I'm not going to say his name, Otto, so you can't find me, is this party from nowhere. It has happened before, and it did get quite a strong vote. It outranked every other party by a factor of 6 on Facebook. And certainly my concierge, you know, a lot of people might have voted for reform thinking it was about reform, thinking it was insurgent, thinking it was all about justice, having found them the first time. But just back to Labour, we can maybe look at So, I want you all to think, anything we know about new cabinet. I suppose he hasn't seen the King yet, has he? Has he gone up to see Charlie Boy?
Yeah, it's there.
Oh, it's there?
Oh, no,
He's behind you.
Oh, all right.
Has he actually been in the... We should maybe take a moment when... Because it's the first time... 20. First time a Labour Prime Minister since Gordon Brown. It's the first time, as I said, we have a Prime Minister who's not part of a private members club. Or at least elected. Gordon Brown wasn't. And it's a big moment. But if the things that don't cost money, right? Because everybody's saying there's no money in the kitty. He rise much worse state than Labour in 1987, thanks to Ken Clarke and John Major, who retrospectively... don't they look pretty good compared to other Conservatives? The economy was in a good shape. We joined the single market, and we could spend more money on health and education, or Blair could. But Blair did usher in quite a few constitutional reforms, keep on pointing out the devolved nations, during the Human Rights Act. Well, it's not happening, but freedom of information, that's not very free at the moment. What are the cost-free kind of things they could do? I'm wondering, Adam, just to go to you first, are there things they could do with Parliament, like make the ministerial code
Yeah,
enforceable?
they are doing some of that, reforming the ministerial code, having a COVID commissioner to look into the PP scandal. Minister's interest, the independent advisor to the Prime Minister will be able to launch his own investigations. So there definitely are some things that they're doing which look positive and won't cost any money. Some of the other things they've kind of backed away from, so House of Lords reform.
I was going to ask
originally, he promised to abolish the House of Lords. That's now pretty much been kicked into the long grass.
But he is apparently going to ennoble a large number of Labour peers.
Yeah, so he's now going to add a load more peers.
Are you up for one? No, I think you're too independent. You are Lord Otto of Ladywell. Baron Otto Ladywell.
Viscount Lewisham already exists, doesn't he?
Who's Count Lewisham?
Oh no, it was he was a UKIP MEP.
Thank God we forgot his name.
Yeah,
Let's
I
move
know,
on.
thank God I forgot his name.
And you haven't mentioned the F word.
But another one would be voting reform.
Yes.
Which Keir Starmer has previously said that he supports. When he was campaigning to be Labour leader, he said he was in favour of a more proportional system. He's now backed away from that. Obviously, we got a deeply unproportional result in this election. Where
The most disproportionate ever, I think. Yeah.
But that could be tactical voting. We've got to remember, people are playing the game according to the rules they have. Were it a proportional system, they might have voted differently. Yeah, if it was a transferable vote. Can I just talk about this work you did, Josiah? Because there was an absolute attempt to make things incredibly favourable to the Conservatives. They doubled the spending cap, right? Obviously, that slightly backfired because they started losing and people started giving them money from, what's it, to 15 to 30 million?
Roughly, yeah.
We know, we can't report about it because for legal reasons, there are large amounts of money spent by hedge funds and things like that in the background on Facebook ads, on AstroTurf groups. That didn't seem to work. They doubled, and they allowed people from overseas to vote, didn't they?
Yeah. That was actually, again, another issue that wasn't discussed at all. The franchise grew massively during this election. While the Conservatives were talking about Labour rigging next elections by giving 16 and 17-year-olds the vote, they'd actually just added 2 million people potentially to the electoral roll by letting everyone who lives overseas for 15 years vote. Obviously, that's a change that some people support or don't. But the fact is they brought in a lot of these changes with almost no consultation and discussion with opposition parties or even with the public. So that was one big change. Nearly doubling the spending limits, gutting the Electoral Commission. They stopped the Electoral Commission being able to launch its own criminal investigations. They set the Electoral Commission strategy now. So our independent elections watchdog, well, we probably shouldn't call it independent anymore. They are now a sort of government-directed elections watchdog. They did all these things. And voter ID, exactly, a really, really big one, actually. And, there were lots of pictures of queues around the country during voting yesterday. Right. I think a lot of people saw those and they thought, and partly it was, a lot of people thought, there was great engagement. It's great to see people queuing up to vote. Actually, I think when we saw the final turnout stats, which weren't that great, I think a lot of those queues were down to the fact that we had these voter ID rules, and there will be stories coming out in the next few days, and we'll be writing some of them, about people who were turned away. I heard stories of NHS workers turning up at the ballot box, presenting their NHS IDs. Good enough for the NHS, apparently not good enough for the polling station.
Veterans weren't allowed to use their veterans.
Veterans turned away. Young people basically having to fight at with clerks to get their right to vote by presenting their student IDs or pass cards. So there are a lot of injustices, I think, and obviously the postal vote chaos as well. That was, I think, really representative of some of the breakdown of our public services. Even the very voting process, I think, had major issues, and that was down to some of those services being cut to the bone over the past decade.
And this does, I think we can fairly say from all our reporting, this was a deliberate strategy inspired often by what happens in America of voter suppression. A lot of the connections, the personnel advising the Conservatives were that way. So there's easy wins there. It costs them nothing to give the Electoral Commission force, to make the cap on spending, to have 16 to 70-year-olds be able to vote, to have automatic registration. 8 million unregistered people, aren't there?
Yeah, they will do these things, some of these things, I think, and in some ways, thankfully, because of the Conservatives, they'll be able to do these things without much need for consultation with the Conservatives and be able to face down some of that gnashing of teeth. But really, long term for the health of democracy, I don't think that's actually the best approach. One thing that potentially is a risk with these changes to the elections watchdog, I mean, are Labour now going to say, you know, we will give the Electoral Commission back its full independence? Part of me thinks, well, if they want to introduce things like, you know, votes at 16 and 17, universal electoral registration, they're probably going to want to tell the Electoral Commission what to do. So we have crossed a slight Rubicon on that front.
Except
I think.
Labour set up the Electoral Commission, didn't it? Was it?
In 2000, yeah.
Yeah, so it had a history of thinking ahead for the whole of the country. And maybe we'll see, this is what we're going to do in the next few weeks, is to see if Starmer abides by, you know, that sort of sense that he's a lawyer. You want to say something's happening up there, Otto?
But I don't know, I can't tell because the mute's on. But it looks to me, what do you think? It looks to me like Sunak's about to walk out of Downing Street.
Giving his farewell.
Is it?
Maybe.
Well, there's a crowd gathering in Downing Street on the left.
Oh, no,
That's
that's
Palace.
Starmer's statement, I think.
On the left, that's Downing Street. Isn't it?
Yeah, Starmer's going to make his speech.
Or we could maybe
Starmer's going to make his speech.
we could maybe put the sound on when he looks
Sunak
like he's
gave a
making
speech, I think.
not now, when he looks like he's going to make a speech. Thank you so much.
The standards in public life cost nothing. I think that's going to be a big change. And actually, you know, Starmer got a bit criticised for it, perhaps understandably during the campaign, for saying stability is the change. But actually, expectations are so low in terms of policy achievements that just having, hopefully, a party or, you know, a prime minister who at least says he's committed to standards in public life and can be held to that, that will be, I think, a breath of fresh air for a lot of people. A lot of people will be, I think, looking forward to that a little bit.
So I want to, before because we've got about another 15 minutes and it will cut away if Starmer speaks outside number 10. Where is he now? Is he coming back from the palace? I can't really turn around and crane my neck.
No, I think
Is he left the
going
palace?
to the palace?
He's expected
I think
at
he'll
the
be.
palace.
Yeah,
Sunak
he's due to give his speech, I think, at around
So
20
Adam,
past.
why are all those people gathering in Downing Street? Are they waiting for him to...
They're waiting for him. Yeah, he'll come out and speak in
clappers.
front of them. Yeah,
Yeah. So
Starmer.
A new
Sunak
dawn.
spoke earlier.
Really?
Yeah.
Sunak's left. They had.
Right.
For people on TV, I don't know what they're saying either. But apparently has to walk and things like this. Please chat among yourselves.
Might even have an umbrella, be radical change.
Yeah, you have an umbrella.
I mean, that is very
lot of-
symbolic. There's a lot of umbrellas in Downing Street.
And a lot of
That's
Union
sort of
Jacks.
symbolic
A lot of
dawning a
Union
new
Jacks
day.
out
Union
there.
Jack.
They've managed to bring a brolly.
We have a question. I will take that question in a moment. I have two questions, and I might need somebody with a mic. 3 questions. Let's get some questions in. That's just the Union Jack. You did mention that. After Brexit, the rise of the SNP had happened from 2008 onwards, and also the issue in Northern Ireland of a hard border or not. We talked about the potential breakup of the UK. We're not talking about that now, are we? I mean, that seems to be receding. The UK, Hardeep's dress last night. The world has changed in that way. We are talking about a unified Britain.
Well, certainly in terms of I don't think there's going to be another independence referendum anytime soon. Although the SNP's support they've still got a base upon which to build. They've still got around 30% of the vote in.
Yeah, they're not gone away at all, but that issue of a referendum. So who had their question first? Somebody, that gentleman over there, if you could move over there, Marcus, thank you. As I said, we select our audience specially for their bias towards Byline Festival. Have you got a quick question, sir?
Yes, very quick. Maybe this is a challenge to Byline Times, but over the last 6 weeks, the Tories have been appointing their own to committees, boards, and so on across the public and quasi-public sector. How can we all work to change those appointments?
Brilliant question. Could maybe take a second question from the lady in front of you? People think they've got an answer to that.
Hi. I actually just wanted to say a word of celebration because I think that everybody in this room and Byline Times leading the process as well, I mean, being a major part of it, is we've been part of the resistance and we won. The progressives have absolutely dominated this politics. It's not been said in those words. And I just want to say, well done you, well done us. I mean, Well done, everybody that has been helping with that process. It's high time. And now we have a chance to move forward with a decent approach to politics that the British were proud of and need to get back. And so we need to continue to fight the toxicity of the politics that Brexit brought with it. That toxicity still hasn't gone away, but now he's in, the person we're not allowed to mention and others are in Parliament. They have to be held to account for the dreadful damage that they have done to our country.
Very good. Thank you so much, and thank you all of you. We'll take another couple of questions in a moment. I would like Hardeep to first respond to that issue of holding to account. Byline Times is not allied to any party. It is allied to values of openness, transparency, anti-corruption, anti-racism, and all the things in the rule of law we think democracy works. It does pose us what's our job here in the future. And then I think maybe Adam, Josiah, and Otto should think about where are the dirty things lurking? All these people in Ofcom, all these people, the regulators. How long will it take to sort of, not purge, because that sounds horribly like something Stalinist, but how, following that gentleman's question, how long we need, my question, how deep was the culture change embedded by the Conservatives after 15 years, and how long will it take to cure it? But while you're thinking about that big question, those big thoughts, I want Hardeep to discuss, and we've been beginning to have this conversation, what's Byline Times' role now the resistance has reoccupied Paris?
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much for that comment, because I feel it is a big moment of celebration. I was here wearing a Union Jack dress last night, and there's a lot of emotionality for me, because last night when the exit poll came out, I was thinking of all those people we lost during the pandemic that didn't need to go, all the lives lost to austerity. We've been through so much as a country, and it has been really, really hard. And one of the things that has been a great privilege for all of us here at Byline Times is in the last few years, when we get messages of support from our subscribers, and they say, we just felt a little bit less lonely knowing you were there. And I think there is something about owning that. This is our country. We're all citizens. We're all fellow countrymen and women. We have to own that. We can't just be despondent and hopeless, because otherwise nothing changes. And the big thing I always say about Byline Times is, if I thought that I, as an editor, could change the world with Byline Times, I'd go to sleep crying every night, because I can't do that. But what is so important is it doesn't have to be all or nothing. Change actually comes incrementally. It comes from each and every one of us doing our bit to move things along just a tad. And then that has a ripple effect. And over time, everything shifts just a little bit and a little bit more. And I think what is really empowering about the work we do is it's not actually saying, well, Byline Times is going to hold Starmer to account. He's going to change his policy because of us. But what we can do, and what we'll continue to do, is hold the government to account, as we have, on the principles that we stand for, which is for the rule of law, against corruption, for democracy, to name a few. And maybe we will, as we've done with the Conservative governments, nudge the established press with the resources and the impact they have, which is, more influential than us. Maybe we can nudge them in the right direction. That's what we will continue to keep doing. And also, there's so many of us who are a bit outside and are looking on and don't feel that what's been happening has been representative of how we are. And there's more of us, and I think there's a lot of belonging we can find in that. I think the election result shows there is a progressive majority in this country. It's just never been framed in that way. So I really think this comment is important. This is our country. We have to feel that. We have to live that. And we have to take small steps to keep changing what we can. We can't lose sight of that.
I want to take a couple more questions, but I will get back to this point of what we can do and the culture change. One example, though, somebody wrote a very good report about 100 Labour MPs who've taken money from water companies. One of the things we look at is lobbying, dark money, commercial interest, distorting democracy. And though we don't change the world, I think the aim is to stop it getting worse. And we have, when Adam writes about Ian Dale, saying Tunbridge Wells was an awful place, he doesn't want to live there, running for that, he didn't run. We've seen numerous resignations. In fact, I will mention, he's gone now, but Stephen, my co-founder, is on a board with Richard Sharp, who we did not help his future. He was the BBC chair who helped Johnson get a loan. I can say numerous MPs who don't like it when Byline Times writes about them. It causes embarrassment. To advisors on extremism didn't take their place because we exposed them. We'll carry on doing that under Labour. There will be bad apples, but, and Hardeep and I will write about this, and the whole team will write about this, we have to be proportionate. There will be corruption in Labour. There will be lobbying. Would it be as bad as Conservatives? If it does get that bad, we failed. The danger is to say that all as bad as each other when morality is saying, that's bad, that's worse. Can I take 2 more questions and I'll bring the rest of the team in? Gentleman at the back there, who I vaguely recognise.
Are we right to be hopeful about young people and their enfranchisement? Because the examples elsewhere are not very hopeful. You know, we all know about Tommy Robinson and the hinterland there, but we also know about the National Rally. And we know that the National Rally has lots of young recruits, so does AFD.
Yes.
You
Great.
can't rely on young people to be nice, let alone progressive.
Okay, can we have one more question and we'll wind up? I notice, so actually, we'll take that gentleman there and we'll answer that, and then there's 2 more and then we'll have to wrap up.
Thanks. I think today was a watershed in our democracy in so much that we've got rid of a party that everybody loathes. But we've got a Labour Party that's going to rule with a minority of people voting for it, let alone a majority of people in the country. What is the case for proportional representation before the next Parliament?
Okay, so let's take those 2 first. When it's talking about young people, I don't really know them. But there's a fairly young person on the channel, on the panel here. Josiah, I don't know how old he is, but he's young. Do we have...
I'll never reveal my age.
After last night, you do. I mean, there is some indication from Reform, a spike, 1 poll, but it's a very small sample, showing it had an uptake of young men, mainly, and it did get the support of Andrew Tate, if you don't know, is a very controversial figure who basically preaches a kind of...
He's a self-described misogynist.
Misogyny, which can appeal...
To clarify, it was Tristan Tate who gave them the money.
No, we're talking about the Andrew Tate in terms of Farage saying... No, Tristan Tate gave money to somebody else. No, this is Andrew Tate, he said, and actually Farage said he supported Andrew Tate, didn't he? Do you sense that this is going to be a problem, or like it is in Germany and France, though the right is quite strong among young people?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, the 2 questions kind of tie in together, because I think there probably is something happening among young men that is concerning, actually, and we should be alert to it. I think particularly with the rise of sort of alt-right influencers on TikTok and other channels. And I think parties need to start listening to young people, and they need to start talking to them. Having people who are young in politics really matters for that reason. Having people who listen to young people. I think the election campaign was actually really dispiriting from the Conservatives, because they targeted almost everything, a tiny number of older voters. I'm hoping that the fact that didn't work for them electorally, the fact that all this talk of Mickey Mouse degrees and just basically writing off young people and that not paying off, I hope the Tories will think we do actually have to start listening to them. But actually, I think it's a fool's errand to think about things like political reform just in terms of, progressives will gain if we enfranchise this voting group. I don't think political reform should ever work like that, and I think the same with proportional representation, actually. You will get people, understandably, saying if we had PR, we'd get more Reform MPs. That's right, I think that's right. I think it's, in some ways, as loathsome as many of their politics are, Nigel Farage has never been held to account before in the House of Commons. He's never had to reveal his declarations of interest, where he's getting his money from. He will have to do that now. The spotlight will be on him in a slightly different way, I think. And I think that's positive. it is never a good idea to lock millions of people out of democracy and to hope that that goes well and just have your fingers crossed that you can keep them locked out forever. You can't, and you need to hold these politicians to account. Sometimes that's from within the Commons itself.
Can I just add on young people? I think the evidence of, in this country, I think you're right about in other countries, the rise of the right among young people. I think the evidence in this country is fairly limited so far. And actually, when you look at these results, where the Green Party did really well, where they made their biggest gains, are actually in those seats with a high proportion of young people. So there is actually a big shift towards the Green Party among young people. I certainly know from my own kids.
My daughter said she was going to vote Green. Yeah.
So I think that's something that Labour have to actually keep in mind as well.
That poll was Matthew Goodwin's
yeah,
lot,
200
wasn't it?
people.
And I'd take it with a pinch of salt. I would.
Bold of assault.
Yeah, and what Josiah was saying about we can't be cautious with democracy and treat people like children and treat the nation like children. If reform have supporters, they need to be represented, and we have to, in a democracy, allow people we disagree with into the chamber, and it would do them immense damage. It will do them immense damage, because not just because they'll have to declare their interests, but because a lot of these people are not serious people. And if you let them in, you will expose them for who they are. And I think we've grown up enough to do that.
And that's the evidence, isn't it? The exposure of Brexit certainly happened in Poland. When these populist parties get in power, they lose support. That's two last questions, and we'll call it a day. Two questions over here. That gentleman there in the middle. And was it you, sir? Wait, so just this last question then, sir, in the middle. Yeah.
With the talk of political cultural reform and constitutional reform and all that, including PR and stuff, is there a time now to be talking about republicanism? The ultimate good chap, Nepo baby, is the king. And the first thing these MPs are going to do is swear allegiance to him personally, rather than the state, rather than democracy, anything like that. So personally, as a Republican, I mean, I'm chomping about it for ages, but definitely now is the time, I would say, to bring it about if we're going to talk about political reform and cultural reform.
Okay, that's a very good last question to close on, and talking about is change in British. We don't tend to have revolutions, we have evolutions. This whole Burkean thing. We don't cut the heads off. Well, we did actually. We cut the head off our king much before the French. 150 years. They never give us any credit for that.
That narrative is often trotted out, and it's just not true. That's the narrative of the establishment. Oh, we don't do revolutions here. And then you look at the history; it's dotted with revolutions. Well, you know, I was blabbering on about 1381 and the Peasants' Revolt yesterday. It wasn't a revolt. It was a revolution in which they cut off the Chancellor of the Exchequer's head.
I mean, it's an interesting question. I think one of the striking things in some of these culture wars of the past few years is the extent to which Prince Harry marrying Meghan Markle was such a flashpoint, out of all proportion, for so much of our tabloid press. And I think why I'm mentioning it is not because I think it's just some sort of tabloid story. I think it was a cultural moment. I think there was something not just symbolic, it was something quite substantial in that. The backlash to them as a couple for what they represented or were perceived to represent, I think is really striking. So this notion that they're this woke couple that want to have it both ways, be part of the royals, go off, make money. But the fact is, we did have for the very first time in our royal family a woman of colour joined that family, and now she is with Prince Harry across the Atlantic. And Prince Harry, might I add, is probably the most prominent person in this country trying to take on the Murdoch empire.
The whole press.
You know, and because he wants to clean up journalism, and we've got to a point where we have a prince of the realm who's the only one trying to really do that. But I think the younger generations perceive things like royalty, hierarchy, aristocracy, and all the trappings in a really, really different way. It is just a complete generational shift from the older generations for whom the Queen had such resonance and that family mattered. And you know, this year we've had King Charles and the Princess of Wales have been unwell, and there has been, I think, some public sympathy. But the notion that this family innately represents what we are as a country, I think that notion is long gone. And I think it's not for me to say what should happen, but I think part of the discussion in this country should be, where does that notion of inequality systemically, where does that come from? And it comes from the fact we think we've got a representative of God on earth who is King Charles, which is kind of crazy. But I don't think that Keir Starmer is going to go anywhere near discussions of this kind. I think, as Adam has alluded to, on issues of patriotism, which the royal family is very much seen a part of, he will play it quite safe, I think.
So you wore that dress, Hardeep, which was reminiscent of Spice Girls and Cool Britannia. We'll finish in a moment and watch Keir Starmer's speech. So that wasn't in Labour's manifesto.
What, the dress?
No. Or Cool Britannia. All those cultural changes. I just want to come back to Josiah and Adam just to finish this thought. What do you think the unanticipated cultural change would say? I mean, you've looked at, Adam, you studied those polls generationally, like 5% Conservatives. Is, in a way, Keir Starmer at the back end, if you like, of a leading edge of quite big cultural change we could see in this country?
Yeah, and I think one of the striking comments that he made during the course of the campaign is that he does want to end the sort of years of division and the years of culture wars. And it'd be interesting to see whether he actually meets that pledge or not, and the extent to which, under pressure from reform in a lot of seats, under pressure from a press that is going to be relentlessly attacking the Labour government on the so-called war on woke, picking out every single example of potential wokery in the government. It's going to splash the Daily Mail several days a week.
But the Daily Mail failed.
The Daily Mail failed. So I think Labour should stand up to that.
Yeah.
And they realise that stand up quite strongly. I'm just interested to see whether Keir Starmer actually does. Yeah.
And just finally to you, Josiah, because we're deferring to you, because you're going to pay our pensions if we get that far. You talk to the Republican Party quite a lot, don't you? And you write about them. And do you think there is a slow, roaring tide away that could see, after a few years, a sort of Scandinavian-style monarchy going around on bicycles and things like that, whatever they do in other countries?
Well, I think it is amazing how little you hear anything from Republicans in any sort of UK media, actually, considering probably about a fifth of people do want a republic. Never covered in the press. There's probably maybe 20 MPs who are Republican now in the new Parliament.
Openly Republican.
Yeah, well, indeed.
Because in private, it's going to be a far higher figure. Yeah.
Closet Republican.
True.
I mean, I have to say one of the most shameful moments of this government was Republican protesters being detained during the coronation.
Yeah. No, that was
He was one of them.
Why?
Well, indeed.
Troublemakers in
Really?
this very hall.
What, during the coronation?
Security, get him out. Get him out.
That was shameful. There were lots of examples like that, unfortunately, of the right to protest being completely crushed. Labour have been very quiet on that, actually. It would be interesting to see what they do. There's a court case coming up at the end of this month, which apparently will have very big ramifications for the right to protest. It's basically the last government appealed a ruling that slapped down some of the anti-protest legislation. That's coming back now under a new government. Will Labour persist in trying to keep up these anti-protest laws?
There's one ray of hope we do have as our Prime Minister, and we'll finish and we can watch him make a speech, a human rights lawyer who fought for the McLibel case, fought for the right of death row inmates in British Crown dependencies and kept them alive. So maybe some spark of that human rights law is still around.
We'll actually be able to talk about human rights again, rather than purely through a negative lens. We're going to see government talk about rights again, and I think that will be a really interesting shift. And every single day, people forget this, government makes thousands of decisions, thousands of small decisions that don't end up on the front page of the Daily Mail. Those decisions are now going to be made by a very different government, and that will be small changes every day which change how our country is run. And I think that will be something we should look forward to a bit.
There's going to be a brilliant sideshow as well, which is going to be the Conservative Party leadership.
Oh, that's going to be lurid.
Which is going to be the most hilarious pantomime.
Yes,
rats in a sack.
I can see the article coming.
I can see. I mean, it's going to be hilarious. It's going to be hilarious.
Yes, we're all, yes.
That's an exclusive later on, I think. Yeah.
So we better wind up here, and I better look at the right camera again. Thank you to this great audience for your hope and inspiration. Last night you were all a bit down, but I think it was just you drunk too much. Now you've had a cup of coffee and you look a bit brighter, and we have a bright new dawn, a bright new future. For everybody watching at home, thank you for joining us. This is our last live broadcast from the festival. There may still be tickets for Saturday. I don't know, day tickets, if you want to come and see our fantastic panels, our talks, there's music, there's book signings, there's the Bad Press Awards, there's live utter bollocks. We talked about pushing the Brexit bollock up the hill. Well, John Mitchison and Otto English will be juggling
We
bollocks.
won't actually literally be doing that, just metaphorically, yes.
And anyway, so
Something nobody wants to see that, yeah.
So well done everybody for staying up and watching all this. Well done everybody for caring about our democracy. This is a moment to celebrate. You vote Reform, Conservative, Green, Independent, Labour. Well done for standing up for democracy. This has been a peaceful succession unless something happens outside number 10. But at the moment, it's all looking good. We'll go and watch that, and we'll see you again with more Byline Times coverage of this amazing electoral period. Thank you.